August 14, 1944, Camp Aliceville, Alabama. A flat heat-hazed plain of scrub and cotton, 70 miles of red clay and mosquito song from the nearest town. The sun pressed down on the canvas tents like an oven lid. The wire fences threw tight grid shadows across the parade ground. It was here, at the low-slung POW compound ringed by watchtowers, that a transport of shaken, dusty men was shoved from the back of a truck and ordered into a line under the square of Lieutenant Harold Thompson's sharp, sunburned stare. They came off the trucks in groups in a knot of 6, a dozen. Ranks that were loose because the war had already loosened them. In the front, Sergeant Feldwebel Otto Weber kept his chin high. His M43 field blouse was dusty but buttoned. His boots had the old polish of a man who had once been proud of the shine. Behind him, a younger corporal, Dieter Lang, rubbed sunlight from his eyes and squinted as if the brightness itself were an interrogation. Around them, the soundscape was a churn of voices, clipped German curses, the bark of American NCOs, the distant clatter of a deuce-and-a-half shifting supplies, the metallic hum of a generator. Corporal James Jim O'Leary, a compact man with a cigarette permanently at the lip when he thought the colonel wasn't looking, stood by a table with a clipboard, an M1 Garand slung over his shoulder in the smugly casual way of men who had carried it since North Africa. Beside him, Private Raymond Ellis, still adolescent-faced and shaking his sun-creased fatigue, held a crate of Red Cross parcels. The parcels smelled of chocolate, powdered milk, and the lemon tang of canned fruit. The smell made the German men freeze in an instant of animal recognition. Food. Weber's eyes took in the barbed wire, the towers, the sentries in helmets, the snarled German insignia patched onto fraying greatcoats. But what snagged his attention were the hands of the men checking their papers. One of the guards, a broad-shouldered corporal named Frank Nolan, tore open a Red Cross parcel, unfolded a battered newspaper, and without ceremony, offered a cigarette to an older German lieutenant, whose uniform was open at the collar and whose face held the small, stubborn pride of old order. "Rauchen?" the lieutenant asked, uncertain and almost ceremonious in his German. There was a tremor, not in the offer but in the willingness to accept. The lieutenant's fingers hovered, then closed around the cigarette as though grasping at a private forbidden treaty. For a beat, there was silence like a held breath. The wire snapped with distant wind. The lieutenant struck a match on a rough wooden block and inhaled. The cigarette's smoke drifted in the sun. The woman at the intake tent hustled paperwork. The watchtower radio squawked. Weber watched the scene with a compact inward fury. Not anger, not yet, but suspicion. Nazi radio had taught men like him to expect hatred. Americans as monsters, as booted beasts who would strip them of dignity and shred their souls. Instead, a corporal with a soft laugh thrust another newspaper, a Sunday edition heavy with photographs, across the table and said in a rough, apologetic English, "Read the comics if you like." The German men's faces shifted in that instant. Mockery, fear, then a slow dawning curiosity. Lang's hand trembled as he took the paper. He smoothed it with the care of a man touching contraband. The first sensory collisions were small and precise. The tobacco tasted different, sweeter, milder, than the hard black German blend they were used to. The paper smelled faintly of print press oil and lemon. Nothing like the propaganda leaflets folded into their backpacks back home. The layout of the pages, the headlines in bold, the photographs of baseball players smiling, made the men blink as though waking from a dream. Outside, an American Jeep idled, its engine ticking and cooling in the heat. Inside the tent, 2 guards laughed over a joke. One tossed a chewing gum wrapper into the trash and reached for a second cigarette to offer. Not all of the Germans took the gifts. A few kept their distance, the old loyalty to the Reich thrumming in their jaws like a warning. Oberleutnant Friedrich Keller, a compact, hard-faced man from the Ruhr whose accent carried the clipped consonants of an industrial district, watched the handouts like a man watching a snake. He remembered the Reich's words. America was decadent, cruel, ready to humiliate. He had been ordered to resist morale collapse at any cost. Yet even he that evening would be caught pockets deep in an American-issued sweater, savoring the change in temperature against his skin and the faint, guilty pleasure of a piece of chocolate. In the weeks that followed, the small gestures multiplied into routine. Guards handed out extra rations when shipments arrived. A lieutenant lent a prisoner his pocket copy of Mark Twain. A sergeant, who had once been a coal miner in Pennsylvania, recommended the comics to a group of bedraggled young men who'd never before seen a word balloon full of jubilant nonsense. On the perimeter, sentries rotated in 3-hour shifts with songs hummed under breath and the steady clop of boots on wood platforms. The tower's spotlight sweeps were less a promise of violence and more a pattern of caretaking. The men inside grew hungry for familiarity, but hungry for the wrong sort of familiarity. The familiarity of expectation. Rumors slithered like small, nervous animals. The Americans dress prisoners well because they want them pliant. The Americans give cigarettes to keep them quiet. The Americans let them write home so they can send lies back. Each rumor arrived as proof of the old teachings until the proof became habit, until the habit became awkward, kindly gestures that couldn't easily be explained away by propaganda. And so the first night in the tents at Camp Aliceville, under the whispering cottonwoods and the watchful shine of the moon, Feldwebel Otto Weber lay awake, cigarette between his fingers. He listened to the muffled laughter of the guards and the soft rustle of a newspaper, turned by Dieter Lang in the next bunk. In the dark, with the smell of American tobacco mingling with the pine, he wondered at the world as if it had tilted on its axis, and he could not tell if it was tilt or a trick. By the end of August, the rhythm of Camp Aliceville had settled into something that felt, to the German prisoners, disturbingly ordinary. Dawn came with the crack of a bugle and the distant sputter of trucks warming on the motor pool road. The sun lifted itself over the guard towers like a coin through fog, turning the barbed wire silver. Feldwebel Otto Weber stood in roll call formation with 600 other men, the dust curling at their boots. The faint smell of coffee and fried eggs drifting from the American mess hall beyond the fence. It was the smell that tormented them the most. Food. Real food. The kind they hadn't seen since before the war began. The prisoners' own breakfast came moments later. Oatmeal, white bread, and canned peaches. It was rich compared to what the Wehrmacht had eaten on the Eastern Front, and so good that even the hard-edged Oberleutnant Keller ate it in silence. Spoon-scraping metal tin, eyes lowered. Guards walked the fence line with easy, rolling strides, rifles slung, hands occasionally tucked in pockets, their talk full of baseball and girls back home. Most were reservists or young men awaiting reassignment. Corporal O'Leary, who had become a sort of unofficial liaison to the German barracks, had an instinct for disarming tension. He'd bring over a bundle of the Birmingham News when the post truck arrived and hand them to Weber with a casual nod. "Thought you might want to see what's going on outside," O'Leary would say, then grin. "There's a crossword in there too if you're into puzzles." Weber would take the paper carefully as though it might burn his hands. The first time he read the English headlines slowly, with halting translation whispered between the men. Yankees. Win. Series. Allied. Forces. Advance. The tone of the articles was jarringly different from the propaganda sheets he'd grown up reading in Essen. There were no grand speeches about conquest. No portraits of Hitler, no insistence on racial destiny. Just facts. Editorials, sports results, obituaries. The prisoners passed each section around like contraband, tracing the faces and photographs, whispering questions that none of them could answer. Some evenings, when the Alabama air thickened with crickets, the guards leaned against the wire to smoke and talk. Cigarettes became the universal currency, not for barter, but for humanity. O'Leary would strike a match on his boot sole and gesture toward a group of prisoners playing chess with carved soap pieces. "You guys really built that?" he'd ask, genuinely curious. A young corporal from Dresden named Hans Ritter would look up from the board, his blue eyes reflecting the ember of the cigarette. "Yes," he'd say in careful English. "Soap from ration. And the board from—" He'd tap the table made from Red Cross boxes. "This." The exchanges were small, but each carried a charge, an erosion of the invisible wall that Nazi ideology had built inside the prisoners' heads. They had been told Americans were soft, lazy, morally diseased. Yet here they were, soldiers who laughed easily, who read newspapers out loud, who passed cigarettes through the wire and never raised their rifles unless protocol demanded. There were, of course, moments of tension. A guard's tone too sharp, a prisoner refusing an order. Once a man named Kruger, a former SS corporal with the lightning rune still faintly visible on his sleeve, spat on the ground when offered a smoke. "I will not take charity from an enemy," he said. The words fell into the hot air like stones, but even Kruger's defiance softened over time. The next week, when rain flooded the tent rows and soaked every bedroll, O'Leary appeared with extra blankets and passed one to Kruger without a word. The German stared at the wool, then at the guard's face, and finally muttered a quiet, "Danke." The rain changed the sound of the camp. The patter on canvas, the smell of wet soil, the rhythmic knock of drops against mess tins created a kind of music. Inside the barracks, the prisoners dried socks by the iron stove and swapped stories of families in Bremen or Munich, of wives who wrote letters with perfume on the paper. Some spoke of the Eastern Front in tones too flat to be nostalgia. Weber listened more than he spoke. He'd begun to keep a small notebook, sketching what he saw: the fence, the guard tower, a stray dog that followed the kitchen truck each morning. One night, O'Leary caught sight of the drawings while checking the barracks. "You got talent, Otto," he said quietly, glancing over the pencil lines. "You should show these to Captain Henderson. He likes art." Weber looked up, surprised to hear his first name spoken without rank or derision. "It is nothing," he said quickly, closing the notebook. But later, as the barracks lamps dimmed and the men settled into sleep, he turned the book back open. On the blank page he drew a cigarette balanced between two hands, one wearing an American uniform sleeve, the other a German, with the smoke curling up between them, blurring the line of the wire fence. It was, perhaps, the first image he had drawn that wasn't about war. By October 1944, Camp Aliceville had transformed from a holding compound into something resembling a small, self-contained town. The days no longer bled together in shock or disbelief. They followed a rhythm built on mutual recognition. The POWs had grown used to the cadence of English words shouted across the yard, the bark of American sergeants whose voices carried authority without hatred. Every morning began with the same sequence: réveillé, inspection, breakfast, work assignments. Some prisoners were sent to pick cotton or load lumber. Others, like Weber and Ritter, stayed behind to maintain the camp's internal workshops. The U.S. Army allowed prisoners to build furniture, craft art, and even perform plays. The idea, as Captain William Henderson explained to his junior officers, was to treat them like men, not monsters. We want them to go home knowing what America really is. That philosophy trickled down to the smallest gestures. The guards rarely shouted now. The prisoners rarely resisted. On Sundays, the men were allowed to gather near the rec hall, where an old Victrola played soft swing music over the hum of insects. Even those who didn't understand the lyrics could sense something tender in the melodies. Dieter Lang, who had once manned a machine gun in Italy, listened to the scratchy voice of Glenn Miller and murmured, "It sounds like peace." The newspapers kept coming. Some arrived days old, the ink smudged from travel. The German men would spread them across tables, tracing the photographs of Allied troops, the front-page maps showing arrows of advance pushing toward Germany. It was a strange sensation, reading about the slow collapse of their homeland while sitting under the Alabama sun, a world away. The guards didn't gloat. O'Leary once caught Ritter staring at a headline that read, "Allied forces cross the Rhine," and simply said, "Tough news, huh?" Ritter nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Yeah," he whispered. "My brother is there." In moments like those, the boundaries between captor and captive blurred. The guards knew it too. They'd been told that treating prisoners humanely would serve the broader purpose, that once these men returned to Germany, they'd carry memories of decency that propaganda could never erase. But for the guards themselves, it was simpler. They saw tired men who just wanted the war to end. One evening, after roll call, O'Leary sat outside the guard barracks, smoking his last Lucky Strike. Through the wire, Weber and Lang approached hesitantly. "Corporal," Weber called out, his accent thick but his tone careful. "May we ask you something?" "Shoot," O'Leary said, flicking ash. "We have our camp newsletter. We print it by hand," Weber explained, holding up a sheaf of papers. "Would you allow a copy for your men?" O'Leary took the bundle, surprised. The title, Die Brücke, the bridge, was written neatly across the top in blue pencil. Inside were hand-drawn cartoons, essays, even a translated poem by Walt Whitman. "This is good work," he said, flipping through the pages. "Bridge, huh? Between what?" Weber smiled faintly. "Between where we are and what we thought we knew." The next morning, O'Leary showed the newsletter to Captain Henderson, who had it translated and pinned in the mess hall. The officers lingered over the crude but heartfelt writing. "They're humanizing faster than I expected," Henderson muttered half to himself. In the following weeks, exchanges like that multiplied. The guards began learning fragments of German. The prisoners practiced English from discarded magazines. "Howdy," became a running joke, shouted across the yard with exaggerated southern drawls that made everyone laugh. The war still existed out there, in Europe, in the Pacific. But inside the wire, a strange truce had formed. Letters from home arrived sporadically, and those who received them often gathered near the fence line to read aloud. O'Leary noticed one afternoon as Weber unfolded a letter from Essen and went still. "Bad news?" he asked gently. Weber's voice cracked as he answered, "My street, gone, bombed." The guard didn't offer comfort. He simply sat beside him, silent, the only sound the rhythmic rasp of a lighter sparking to life. He passed the cigarette across without a word. Weber accepted. The next morning, when O'Leary made his rounds, a folded piece of paper sat on his bunk. Inside was a pencil sketch. 2 soldiers, 1 American, 1 German, sitting side by side, smoke curling into the same sky. No words, no caption, just that shared quiet. For the first time since arriving at Aliceville, the German prisoners stopped referring to their captors as the enemy. They began calling them Die Wachmänner, the watchmen. There was respect in the word now, even affection. The camp command noted it in reports, morale high. Discipline steady, prisoners cooperative. Relations unusually cordial. But beneath the calm routine, everyone felt a subtle tension, the unspoken awareness that this fragile humanity existed only within these fences. Beyond them, cities still burned. The guards knew it. The prisoners did too, and both sides sensed that one day the gates would open, and whatever bond had formed here would face the cold air of the real world. By November 1944, the evenings at Camp Aliceville had turned cool and brittle. The air no longer clung to the skin. It sharpened it. Pines beyond the wire sighed in the wind, and the nights were punctuated by the faint, rhythmic clatter of trains far off on the freight line. Trains heading east, toward ports, toward war. Inside the camp, the prisoners tried to convince themselves that time moved differently here. But even the Alabama night couldn't keep the world out forever. It began with the newspapers. The same papers that had once been symbols of generosity became slowly harbingers of grief. As Allied armies pushed deeper into Germany, headlines shifted from triumph to aftermath. Aachen falls to U.S. forces, civilians flee Cologne, Ruhr factories in flames. Every day the prisoners gathered to read, and every day fewer spoke. The comic strips went untouched. Weber noticed it most in the faces. The quiet softening of men who once stood rigid at attention. Even Oberleutnant Keller, who had been unbending, sat one morning with his elbows on his knees, staring at a photograph of his home city flattened under smoke. He said nothing when O'Leary passed by, only raised his eyes long enough to take the offered cigarette. Then came the Red Cross broadcast, a portable radio in the rec hall, its static hum filled with voices that none of them had expected to hear. The announcer's German was neutral, precise, and devastating. Concentration camps liberated by Allied forces. Mass graves discovered. Survivors describe. The words rippled through the room like an invisible explosion. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Men who had once scoffed at Allied lies stared at the floorboards as if they could vanish into them. Ritter rose abruptly, face pale, muttering, "Nein, das kann nicht sein. It cannot be." Others joined him, denial curdling into fury. By evening, the camp was restless. Arguments broke out in the barracks, voices thick with guilt, rage, disbelief. Some swore it was all propaganda. Others, quieter and older, said nothing at all. Captain Henderson called his senior guards together in the admin hut. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke. "They're rattled," he said, tapping the ashtray. "We expected it. Keep things calm, let them talk it out. No lectures, no gloating." O'Leary nodded, but that night as he made his rounds, he could feel the unease radiating from the tents like heat. The Germans sat in silence, heads bowed, the newspapers folded but unread. When he paused by Weber's tent, he saw the Feldwebel hunched over his notebook, sketching again. The page showed a man standing between two fences, one neat and orderly like Aliceville, the other jagged and dark, curling in smoke. "You heard the news?" O'Leary said quietly. It wasn't a question. Weber didn't look up. "I did," he replied. His voice was steady, but his pencil pressed too hard, the graphite breaking in his fingers. "All this time we believed the stories, that we were soldiers, not butchers, that we fought for honor." He set the pencil down and met O'Leary's eyes. "Do you still share cigarettes with men like that?" The guard hesitated, then sat beside him on the edge of the bunk. "I share them with men," he said simply. "That's the difference." For a long time neither spoke. The wind rattled the tent flaps. The distant sound of a harmonica drifted from the rec hall. Outside, the floodlight swept across rows of weary faces, men staring at the ground, their illusions collapsing in the space between two breaths. In the days that followed, some prisoners grew withdrawn. Others turned to small acts of penitence, volunteering for extra work details, repairing tools for the guards, cleaning the camp chapel. Keller, who had once lectured his men about loyalty to the Reich, asked to speak privately with Captain Henderson. The meeting lasted an hour. When he emerged, his face was pale, his posture no longer stiff. "I told him everything," he murmured to Weber later. "Every lie we were told." The atmosphere in the camp changed again, not with rebellion, but with a quiet, heavy grief. The guards felt it too. Compassion had grown into something harder, more complex, understanding. One Sunday, O'Leary brought his Bible to the wire and read a few lines aloud to anyone listening. Not to preach, but to offer something steady amid the moral wreckage. The Germans listened in silence. When he finished, a voice called softly from the crowd, "Read it again." And he did. As the late sun turned the wire gold, as a breeze stirred the flag overhead, and as both guard and prisoner realized that what held them together now wasn't rules or duty, but a fragile, necessary grace. December 1944. Snow never settled long in southern Alabama, but frost clung to the ground in the mornings, painting the fences white and stiff. The guards wore wool coats now, their breath visible in the dawn light. Inside the compound, the prisoners moved more slowly, their uniforms faded, their hearts quieter. The air smelled of cold metal and coffee. Mail day had become a ritual, almost sacred. Once a week, a truck arrived at the main gate carrying canvas sacks stamped with red ink. U.S. Army Postal Service. The guards unloaded them with careful hands, sorting envelopes by country and name. When the German stack was ready, O'Leary and another corporal carried it to the barracks, where the men already waited in lines, anxious, fidgeting, whispering names under their breath like prayers. "Ritter Hans," O'Leary called, holding up a letter. The young corporal stepped forward, face pale, fingers trembling. "Danke," he murmured, clutching it as if afraid it might vanish. Around him, others did the same, some smiling faintly, some breaking down before they'd even read a word. Weber received his letter last. He sat on his bunk, opened the envelope with care, and pulled out a folded sheet written in careful script. His wife's handwriting. Lieselotte Weber, Essen. The paper smelled faintly of soap. "Otto," it began. "Our home is gone, but we are alive. I am staying with your sister. I hear that the Americans treat you well. I hope this is true. Do not be ashamed to tell me if it is. I only want you to survive." He read it twice, then a third time. The edges of the letter blurred as tears gathered. Across from him, Ritter sat with his own letter, lips moving as he read silently. After a long moment, he looked up. "She's alive," he whispered. "My mother is alive." O'Leary walked the aisles, collecting discarded envelopes. "You boys want to send replies?" he asked. "We've got paper and pencils at the office." There was hesitation, an old fear that their words would be censored or twisted. But the guards had long since earned their trust. Within an hour, the mess hall became a chorus of scratching pencils and murmured German. Each man poured his heart onto paper, not propaganda, not duty, but simple truths. Weber's letter began slowly, uncertainly. "My dearest Lieselotte, I am in America. It is strange here, kind, warm, confusing. The guards share cigarettes with us. They laugh, they joke. They treat us like people, not enemies. I don't understand it. I thought the world hated us. But here they offer coffee and newspapers. Perhaps everything we were told was a lie." He paused, staring at the page, then continued. "I have seen a world without hatred. If I come home, I want to bring a piece of that world with me. That evening, when the guards collected the finished letters, O'Leary noticed Weber's hands still shaking. You all right, Otto? Weber nodded slowly. When I write to her, it feels like I'm writing to myself, he said, trying to explain who I am now. Later, the guards sat in their hut sorting mail by flashlight. O'Leary read snippets of the addresses. Hamburg, Bremen, Leipzig, towns whose names were now mostly ruins. They've got nothing left over there, he said softly. But they're still writing. Captain Henderson, who sat beside him checking reports, looked up. That's why we do it, he said. Not for them, for what comes after. You teach a man respect in captivity, he'll remember it when he's free. In the following weeks, letters continued to arrive and depart like lifelines. Some prisoners began enclosing small drawings, sketches of the camp, of guards, of the Alabama countryside. Weber sent one of the cigarette drawings to Lieselotte. Underneath he wrote, See, they are not what we thought. On Christmas Eve, the camp chapel filled with a low murmur of voices, English and German mingling. Guards and prisoners stood together as a chaplain read from Luke, Peace on earth, goodwill toward men. The words echoed through the wooden rafters, soft but firm. Afterward, O'Leary walked the perimeter one last time. He stopped near the fence where Weber stood, bundled in a borrowed coat, looking up at the stars. Cold one tonight, the guard said. Weber smiled faintly. Not so cold when someone shares his fire. They stood there in silence, the wire between them almost invisible in the moonlight. Somewhere beyond, a harmonica played a slow, familiar tune, Silent Night, drifting over the frosted earth, and in that moment, it no longer felt like a camp divided by sides, but a fragile island of decency adrift in a world tearing itself apart. April 1946. The war had been over for almost a year. Spring came early to Alabama, the kind that carried the scent of magnolias and wet earth. The barbed wire fences still stood, though now they felt symbolic, like relics of another time. The prisoners no longer lined up under guard. They moved freely within the compound, awaiting their turn to be sent home. The camp was quieter. Many had already boarded trains east, their names crossed off the roster one by one. The men who remained packed their few belongings, handmade chess sets, worn letters, a few American cigarette tins kept as souvenirs. Weber stood near the loading platform with a small suitcase made from scrap wood, a paper tag tied to the handle. Weber, Otto, Essen. Around him men embraced, some with laughter, others through tears they didn't bother to hide. O'Leary approached, his uniform crisp, though his face carried the exhaustion of years spent watching the world unravel and rebuild. He handed Weber a folded envelope. From Captain Henderson, he said. Weber opened it carefully. Inside was a letter written in neat, steady script. Feldwebel Weber. When you first arrived here, I saw a soldier of Germany. When you leave, I see a man who understands peace. Carry that home with you. The world will need it. Capt. R.L. Henderson, U.S. Army. Weber swallowed hard, then looked up. Tell him I'll remember, he said softly. O'Leary smiled, lighting a cigarette and offering one across the gap. Weber hesitated, then took it. The same ritual they'd repeated for months, the same small gesture that had bridged an ocean of hate. You'll be heading through New York, O'Leary said. Then Bremerhaven. Lot of rebuilding waiting for you back there. Weber exhaled smoke, eyes distant. It won't be the same, he said. But maybe it can be better. We've seen what mercy looks like now. As the whistle blew, signaling the train's approach, the prisoners gathered their things. Guards stood at attention, not with suspicion but with quiet respect. Some shook hands. Others exchanged addresses, uncertain if letters would ever reach across a broken continent. When Weber reached the platform, he turned once more toward the camp. The sun was rising behind it, casting long shadows of the watchtowers that now seemed obsolete. The world those towers once defended against had already changed. He caught sight of O'Leary standing by the fence, cap tucked under his arm. The Irishman raised a hand in farewell. Weber returned it, a simple, silent salute between former enemies who had learned to see each other as men. The train lurched forward with a hiss of steam. Through the window, Weber watched the Alabama countryside roll past, the pine trees, the distant farms, the same fields where American guards had once shared newspapers and laughter. He thought of Lieselotte waiting among the ruins, of letters sent across oceans, of nights spent under foreign stars, and above all he thought of that first act of kindness, a cigarette passed through a fence, that had cracked open everything he'd been taught about who was enemy and who was not. Months later, when he finally stepped onto German soil again, Weber found a homeland scarred beyond recognition, cities hollowed out, children barefoot in the streets, hope rationed as tightly as food. Yet when he spoke to the young men gathered among the rubble, he told them stories not of defeat but of dignity. He told them of Captain Henderson, who believed in decency even in wartime, of O'Leary, who shared his rations with those who had once bombed his countrymen, of guards who brought newspapers and treated their prisoners not as monsters but as equals. He ended each story the same way. The war taught me how easily men can destroy, but captivity taught me how they can forgive. Years later, long after the camp had been dismantled and the last watchtower torn down, Otto Weber's son would visit the United States. He would stand on a quiet field in Alabama where wild grass grew over old foundations. There would be no barbed wire left, only wind and open sky. And in that silence, he would unfold one of his father's letters, the one written in December 1944, and read the words aloud to no one in particular. I have seen a world without hatred. If I come home, I want to bring a piece of that world with me. The letter fluttered in the breeze, then stilled, somewhere faintly. It might have sounded like the echo of laughter between two men sharing a cigarette under a warm southern sun. Proof that even in the shadow of war, humanity could survive.